Good afternoon, and welcome to our online discussion of assisted suicide, euthanasia, and disability. My name is Amy Hasbrook, and I'm the director of Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet. We are a project of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, and our goal is to unify, inform, and give voice to the disability rights opposition to assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other ending-of-life practices that have a discriminatory impact on people with disabilities. There's something a little screwy about my setup today, so for some reason my name and information isn't appearing on the bottom, so please excuse the lack of information. The position that we have is fairly straightforward, and there are four kind of main reasons that we oppose euthanasia and assisted suicide. First is that it's unnecessary because everyone already has the option to commit suicide or to refuse medical treatment and to have palliative care on demand until such point as they die naturally. Secondly, it's discriminatory because people without disabilities who express a desire to die are given suicide prevention services, while people with disabilities who express a similar desire are given not only are allowed and encouraged to die, but given help to do so, where assisted suicide and euthanasia are legal. Thirdly, we believe that where people with disabilities in our society don't really have choices about where and how they live, that the idea of a free choice to die is an illusion. And finally, that safeguards do not prevent wrongful deaths of people who should not be killed under such laws, and that there's plenty of evidence to indicate that people with disabilities are in fact killed where it's legal, that shouldn't be dying. The goal of our online discussions is to give people with disabilities a chance to talk about these issues ourselves, among ourselves, because our experience is pretty different. A lot of people who oppose assisted suicide are either religious or very conservative, and their opposition is based on their beliefs. And so our discussion is based more on the disability rights perspective, which is progressive and based on our experience as people who have been discriminated against and who continue to be discriminated against in the medical system. So we feel this is a good opportunity for people to come together and talk about the issues, sharing our own perspective. How to participate? There are several ways that you can join us. One is through our website, which is TVNDY.ca. If you go to our website and click the events tab, you can find a calendar with today's date and select the video link for the English Hangout. Also, you can go to YouTube and look for euthanasia and disability in the search terms, and you will find our videos, not only today's, but all the videos we've done in the past. And we've been doing this for more than a year, so there's plenty of information out there. Thirdly, you can go to Google Hangouts or Google Plus and go to Google Hangouts, and you can participate that way. We have a place where you can ask questions. So you can participate in that way, and you can also join in the discussion. So, and for more information about anything that you hear, any of the subjects we talk about, you can go to our website, which is tvndy.ca. You can also go to our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/toujourvivant not dead yet, or you can follow me on Twitter, which is @TVNDY. And finally, you can email me at info@tv-ndy.ca. Okay, our topics for today are two main topics. One is a debate among professors of disability studies about issues of assisted suicide and euthanasia. And the second is we have a couple of news briefs. Just a minute. Okay. This week, there in a user group that has to do with disability studies, there was an exchange among experts in disability studies and other professors, university professors, about the issue of assisted suicide. And that, that debate was rather vigorous. And that, in addition to a couple of other things that have come up recently, prompted me to decide to take on that debate in our discussion by presenting some of the things I heard in that debate and to make a response based on my experience in this work over the past 17 years. So it was not only this debate that happened this year, but also the position of the plaintiff's attorney in the Carter case, and his name is Joe Arve. He uses a wheelchair. And finally, there is a disability rights studies pioneer, or disability studies pioneer, who has switched position in the last few years. And it's a little bit confusing as to why he has suddenly come out in favor of assisted suicide. So, but be that as it may, there are a number of people defending the idea of assisted suicide. And so I wanted to take that opportunity to respond. Now, I've also heard in different places, some people saying that they feel afraid or intimidated by activists who oppose assisted suicide, saying that there's only one way to think. That's not our intention. And it's obviously, when you have a point of view, you want to convince others of your point of view. But obviously I'm biased because I have, been an advocate in this area, but my effort has not been to try to make people come in lockstep, but to explain and convince people. So be that as it may, many people find our position too rigid, and that is something that came out in this online discussion. So one of the questions that this raised for me is, why do people take a position in favor of assisted suicide other than the reasons that they offer, which are reasons that we can, each reason that people offer are things that we feel are debatable, and we have a position opposite that. And actually, in the past spring, during our online discussions, I went through very detailed, frequently asked questions document that we have that presented a lot of those arguments, hopefully all of them, and our responses to them. So you can look back through there or at our website at tvndy.ca and look at our responses. But I think there are some underlying reasons why people have such a strong response, and especially these disability studies professors. First of all, I think that from the answers that from the comments I was looking at, a lot of people didn't seem to have some information about the issue. They seemed either ill-informed or that they had not researched the issue very well. For example, there are people who are convinced that there's no danger for folks with disabilities. And if you look at some studies that are circulated by the people who favor assisted suicide, it could look like that because they obviously favor certain studies. And those studies seem to say that there's no problem. But if you look at how those studies are done, what you see is that they only cover the reports that the doctors submit in those places where it's legal, and they don't really dig beyond those reports. And it's obviously not what the doctors say that counts, it's what's really happening. And so when you look at other studies that dig beyond the reports, that's where you find the problems going on. So that's what I mean by feeling that people may have lack of information or haven't necessarily studied the issue in depth. Also, it's an emotional issue and a visceral issue. And I will talk a little bit about that later in response to one of the comments that was online. But suffice it to say, when people are afraid or witness something that is frightening or hurtful or whatever, it creates a very strong emotional response. And sometimes it's hard to get beyond that emotional response to look at things in a rational fashion. Also, I think people, if something bad happens, people tend to look in a certain direction. There's an expression, shit flows downhill, which is that if something bad happens, people tend to look at the victim. So if somebody dies in pain, people say, oh, well, you know, we should have assisted suicide so people don't have to die in pain, rather than questioning why somebody died in pain and questioning the system that makes that happen. So that's what I mean by it's an emotional issue, and sometimes it's helpful to think beyond the emotional response. And then the last is that no one wants to feel endangered or as if they have control and independence taken away from them. That is, you know, women who have been raped know how that feels. And a friend of mine who was, who was in a hospital, and the doctor on duty one night tried to encourage him to accept assisted suicide, said he felt that that was a violation in the same sense of being raped, and I completely agree with him. Someone essentially said, your life is not worth living and I will end it for you. So, and no one likes to think about feeling like that. No one likes to think that they're vulnerable in that sense. But not wanting to think about it doesn't mean it isn't true, and it doesn't mean that people are not in danger. And that even, you know, if you do have things settled very well in your life, that something might not happen. You know, you might go to a different hospital where the people don't know you, or, you know, any number of things could happen that could change your situation literally overnight, and you would lose the control that you believe you have. So, okay. So in order to be heard, you have to listen. So that's why I am taking the comments. I didn't write down everything literally, but I did distill the comments that I heard and tried to understand them, and am sort of reframing, stating the comments, and then am responding to them. So the first, here are the arguments and some of the responses. The first person, JD, said that advocates opposing assisted suicide have a unified pro-life, anti-choice position. That, I believe, is a result of bad information, or perhaps he's thinking more about the religious groups. But people with disabilities do not take an anti-choice, uniformly pro-life position. In my work in this field for 17 years, and in having direct contact in several countries, I'm not aware of disability groups taking an anti-abortion position. And there may be individuals within groups who have that position, but as the groups themselves, I'm not aware of that. Generally, the position we take on the issue of abortion is that it is up to the individual, and we recognize that their eugenic abortion is being practiced and it's getting worse. but that the solution is not to restrict access to abortion, but to work with medical professionals and parents to help them understand that life with a disability is not a fate worse than death, and that abortion of disabled fetuses is not the only or even the most appropriate choice. So that is the position we take. Whoops, sorry, I just lost my thing here. And let's see. So it's neither a pro-life sense in that everybody always must live, because our position is, in fact, that if a person wants to die and they take responsibility for it and they do it themselves, either by refusing treatment or by putting their own hand to their death, committing suicide, that is their prerogative. Where we have the concern is that when somebody, if I want to kill myself and I do that myself, that's one thing. But if I ask somebody else to come and help me, that other person has their own feelings and wishes and desires that may be based on devaluation of people with disabilities, negative views. And my position may be limited because of my disability. My options may seem limited. And so if that person is a doctor who in Canada anyway is paid by the state, and in the US, they're largely paid by the state, especially if it's Medicaid or something, then it is a person, it's the state stepping in and saying, rather than giving you more choices on how to live, we're going to kill you. Unlike these other people who ask to die that we aren't going to kill. So it's the moment that the other person steps in and that will kill the person where the problem is. So we don't consider that a pro-life position, and we don't take an anti-choice position, and it's certainly not unified. So perhaps we're just talking, they may be generalizing about the religious, some of the religious or conservative people, but that's certainly not the position of the disability rights movement. Okay, as we were saying, I sort of covered this already, but he was saying that the position encompasses assisted suicide and abortion. And as I said, it's not a unified position. We don't oppose abortion. It's an individual's right to choose, and we don't consider that in the same means as assisted suicide. And then actually, we don't take a position on those issues. We focus on assisted suicide primarily, and to the degree that we do focus on pre-birth issues, it's an educational focus to avoid eugenic abortion, but not interdict it, not prohibit it. JD also said it's a question of individual choice. And as in general, that people with disabilities do not have the full range of choices in our society. If in some future circumstance, disability discrimination no longer existed and people with disabilities had the full range of options, exactly the same as non-disabled people, options in transport, housing, education, recreation, employment, all aspects of life, then perhaps it could be interpreted as more of an individual choice, but that is not the case right now. In addition, because medical professionals tend to devalue people with disabilities, that affects not only the quality of care we get as people with disabilities, but our ability to recover and rehabilitate ourselves if we have an exacerbation of a disability or when we acquire a disability. So all of those factors affect what the individual choice is. And essentially the basic fact of saying that people with disabilities have the right to kill themselves, but non-disabled people who want to die are not going to be helped to die. That's also, it's imposing a choice. So we don't agree with that idea. We don't believe that it's an individual choice. We believe that it's a coercive circumstance. JD also equates disability rights with assisted suicide. He's saying that having disability rights means having the right to assisted suicide. There's no right to suicide in any legal system. That was established in the United States in 1997 and in the Vacco versus Quill and Washington versus Glucksberg cases. And in Canada, the decriminalization of suicide in 1972 was done to, I'm getting stuck on the French word, to improve access to and facilitate suicide prevention services, to enable people who felt suicidal to come and get help. So it wasn't the idea of allowing a right to suicide. Death is not something that we have a right to, it is a fact. And so suicide is not considered a right, although in the Carter case, the judge at the first level said it was, but I strongly disagree with that. So not only is it not a right, it's also not a service provided by the government. And so people with disabilities do not have a claim under disability rights laws to have accommodation in that service. Because when the government provides a service, people with disabilities have a right to accommodation, but the government doesn't provide that service. So there is no right to accommodation in that situation. Okay, the next person to speak said that to ask people to commit suicide themselves without help is in an undignified fashion, all alone, is absurd and narrow-minded. And I would just say that that's exactly what happens to a non-disabled person who commits suicide. We, as a society, have a policy against suicide to prevent suicide. We don't encourage, and it's also in many ways, in most ways, goes against our human psychology to commit suicide. So we, as a matter of public policy, we support people's lives, people to keep living, but all assisted suicide does is to select a group of people that we refuse, that we will no longer support to keep living. So if you consider all people who want to die as a group, assisted suicide selects a part of that group for to be taken out and allowed to die. And the first eligibility criteria for that separate group is that they have a disability, whether or not they have terminal illness, because even where terminal illness is a criteria, disability is also a criteria, and people with terminal illness have disability, and because of the inability to safely predict the time of death, terminal illness is certainly not a very, it's not a hard and fast rule. Also, lots of conditions could be considered terminal, but are in fact not. Like my husband's diabetes could be considered terminal because if he doesn't take his medications, he would die. But most people would not consider diabetes a terminal condition. So it also depends on definition. VES in her comment was talking about that people should, implying that all these bad things about committing suicide should not exist, that people should be helped to commit suicide. But again, she's not being clear if that is everybody, so even a troubled, a teenage boy whose girlfriend just left him she doesn't say whether that boy should be helped to commit suicide or whether it's just people with disabilities. But as it's described by supporters, generally it's just people with disabilities. So she also says that assisted suicide is a dignified and desirable choice, or that's a paraphrase. She didn't say exactly that, but and this gets to the issue of what I often say is that people with disabilities do not have to die to have dignity. And I think that's an important thing to remember. Okay, is that? Okay, that's all that VS said, those 3 comments. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed something. She said, suicide is not pleasant. It's hard on families, and when it fails, it causes more harm. So again, she's talking about troubles with suicide in general, but she's not being clear as to whether this would apply to everyone or just people with disabilities. And again, if you refuse medical treatment and opt to stop eating and drinking and have palliative care until you die, that is a way to kill yourself. It's one of many ways possible for a person with disabilities to kill themselves. Most people who make public requests or go public about asking for assisted suicide are perfectly capable of killing themselves, but they want this fairy tale ending where everybody's sitting around the bed and happy to be together and they just float off on a cloud. That, people, it's not necessarily how life works. So anyway, either we need to make it available to everybody or nobody, because otherwise it's discriminatory. BO talked about her father who died screaming in pain. And I was thinking about that because I had a similar experience recently where earlier this year, my husband was in extreme pain and I was having a hard time getting the medical staff at our local hospital to respond appropriately. They would not give him pain medication, and he was yelling and crying and in huge pain. And that was a very traumatic experience for me. But, and that makes a strong impression. And it's easier to remember a traumatic experience like that than to remember the good days when his pain is at a minimum and he's doing really well. That doesn't make such an impression. And it occurred to me to wonder if this person's father had other good days that might, that she might not necessarily remember. And the other thing that I think is important to remember is that as I had to really fight to get pain relief from my husband, it's very common that you have to fight hard to get adequate pain relief. And that's not a problem of the medical science. That's a policy problem in the way hospitals are run, in the way pain relief is administered, that most doctors don't know anything about easing pain and palliative care. Most doctors receive almost less training in palliative care than do veterinarians. So, but that's not a medical problem, that's a policy problem. And it's not the problem of the person with a disability, it's the problem of the medical system. And like I said, because shit flows downhill, it's easier to sort of take it out on the person with a disability than to fight the system. And certainly, as I learned, you don't get, nobody loves you if you fight the system, and you can get punished for doing that. But it was important to fight to get my husband some pain relief. So that is the kind of emotional impact that this issue has. And it makes a huge impression, but sometimes the impression ends up sort of turning you in the wrong direction. System work for my husband, and for this woman, that a similar experience said, we have to have assisted suicide to kill people or they'll be in pain. So that's the difference. Okay, so we have a right to commit suicide. Oh, this is another person, AP, says we have a right to commit suicide. There's no difference between assisted suicide and suicide. I did address this earlier. When I said that as soon as the third person steps in, or the second person steps in, I should say, that brings both the person's individual issues to bear and also the institutional power behind that person. So if the individual is a doctor, the doctor works for the hospital, and the hospital is receiving funding both from the government and insurance companies. So the doctor has to represent those people to some degree. And the doctor also has his or her own bias about what the quality of life of people with disabilities. And we know from many studies that have been done, especially by Carol Gill, that doctors have a negative view of people with disabilities. So if a person takes it onto him or herself to kill themselves, that's one thing. But it's very different when another person brings their own individual biases and the power of the institution that backs them up into the equation. It becomes very different. Okay, CC said ableism isn't the only issue. And that's true. Ableism is not the only factor, and it's not the only reason that we oppose assisted suicide. I mentioned others above, but CC also said that this is a complex, it's too complex to take an all or nothing position. And I guess I don't agree. I agree that it's very complex, and I agree that it's very difficult. However, one of the complexities is that people with disabilities, some have better control in their lives than others in general, and the others who don't tend to be people with cognitive disabilities, people with psychiatric disabilities, because they are sort of the lowest on the totem pole of receiving respect in our society. So the people who have some control in their society want to change the law to enable them to have what they want, which is a certain preferred kind of death. But the problem is that in doing so, they will put in danger many more people who have less control in their lives. And it's a question of balance. It's a question of, is it fair, or is it a good idea to put many people in danger to satisfy some people's preference for how they want to die? And in my opinion, it's not helpful to consider the needs of a very small number when there are many more people who would be endangered and who would die because of that choice. So in some ways, yes, it's very complex because some people have different needs. I mean, obviously everybody has different needs, but on the other hand, to avoid discriminating and to avoid putting people who are more vulnerable in danger, it's kind of an easy choice, in my opinion. And let's see, BH is another person who chimed in, and he said a mental decline could be a reason for assisted suicide. And this was a little bit the argument that the plaintiffs in the Carter case said, that if somebody is losing their capacity and they have to commit suicide before they lose the ability to do so, then they're losing a certain amount of time. And again, I think this gets to the issue of some people are going to lose some time, and does that justify putting many more people's lives at risk? And again, this gets back to the question of, are people well informed about where the risk is and what is really happening? Okay. BH also said that palliative care doesn't relieve all pain. Okay. There's somewhat of an information issue here, which is many people have seen loved ones have great pain in death and do not understand that that is not because the medical science isn't up to providing pain relief, it's because of the policies, and I talked about that recently. But also, there may be a very small number of people who cannot be relieved with the standard palliative care, and that is why palliative sedation is an option. So if somebody is really in great pain, they can be sedated, and that is an option. So, you know, they would not be conscious of the pain. So that, again, that's an option. But again, it's important to stay clear about what is possible medically and what is available politically. So rather than working to allow assisted suicide, it would probably be better to put the energy toward enabling everybody to have quality palliative care. So EL is a person who was on the conversation, and she described her experience with cancer. She said some cancer treatments and some ways of dying are dehumanizing. This gets back to the issue of dignity that a lot of people talk about. And people talk about having to have help with personal care, and using the toilet or using a diaper or whatever diminishes their dignity. And that is a feeling. I don't think that's a reality. Reality is that people, dignity is within oneself, and it is based on how one interacts with the world, not how the world sees one. It's hard to interact with the world in a positive way when when other people interact with you in a way that degrades you, but that does not mean that you do not have dignity. It just means that your humanity is under attack. And I think it's an important distinction. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. So if I have to have somebody, if I have to use a diaper or don't have bowel control anymore, that doesn't mean I am not dignified. It means that I need a certain kind of help that I didn't need before, and I have to learn to accustom myself to that and to decide that it's okay. And that is a hard decision because of our society. In other societies, it may not be. So that's an issue that's kind of taught rather than that it's not universal. So, and let's see, she says, she also says activists who oppose abortion force fetuses with disabilities disabilities to endure a life of suffering, or may force fetuses. Okay. Okay, first of all, the disability community does not, none of the disability groups who oppose assisted suicide that I'm aware of take a position on abortion. Most of the people I know do not have a pro-choice stance. But the idea that as a person who was born with my disability, whatever suffering I experienced has nothing to do with my disability. It has to do with the way people treated me because of my disability. And even people who live with pain, the pain needs to be adequately treated, but there are many people who live with pain and who have very satisfactory lives. People get used to what they live with what they know. And there are many people with whole bodies who have very unhappy lives. So I don't think it's legitimate to say that not allowing abortion of disabled fetuses is going to force people to suffer. Well, whatever. Okay. She also said we don't hear from enough people who live with pain and difficulty. I don't know about that. Most of the pioneers and people who are very much involved in this movement that I know live with pain and severe disability. I mean, my disability may not be as severe as some people, my visible disability, but I also live with severe depression and PTSD and other things, which has a direct impact on all of this, because I've been suicidal at times in my life. And if, to the degree that people believe my life isn't worth living, that makes it difficult for me to deal with those feelings. And because I cannot find therapists who don't carry the same discriminatory attitudes about disability, my quality of life is diminished because I can't get decent therapy. So I guess I don't agree with her experience that we don't hear enough from people who live with pain and difficulty. Anyway, okay. The last few comments are from a pioneer and major figure in the disability studies movement. And he starts by saying that fear of dependence and death justify assisted suicide, which again, this is the question of what is good for some small number of people. How does that affect other people who may be more vulnerable because their disabilities are viewed as less valuable, and they have less control in their lives because of communication difficulties, because of cognitive or psychiatric disabilities, whatever. And it's strange because this person, again, is talking about fear of dependence, but that's what everybody with a disability deals with. And that's what people who become disabled have to deal with. And that is part of the process of learning to live with disability. It's a grieving process, but it doesn't get better if we say, yes, it's so terrible, you should die. That doesn't help people adjust to learning to be dependent. And also, we live in a society where everyone is dependent. We have an illusion that we're independent, but in fact, it's a very interdependent society. We just need to be a little more honest about it. He also says that people don't want to face the indignity of death from cancer or motor neuron disease. And again, it seems strange to me that he uses this term indignity, whereas part of what we say as people with disabilities is that we have dignity. We are dignified. There is nothing undignified about our existence. So why should that be different if we have cancer or motor neuron disease? Why should that be different if our cancer causes us to lose control of our bladder and bowels? It's not, it's not any different. We're just people. He also says that people with disabilities are not in danger. Perhaps he does not perceive that because he is an academic and is very secure in his life. Perhaps he does not want to credit the studies that show that people with disabilities are in danger. I don't know why he believes that. I don't believe that. From what I have seen and read, from what I know about how societies work, I do believe that people with disabilities are in danger. And finally, he says that people with disabilities are being manipulated by opponents of assisted suicide. And I don't know if he means that people with disabilities are being manipulated by other people with disabilities who oppose assisted suicide, or whether he's talking about the religious groups who oppose assisted suicide. I'm not sure. But first of all, if he's talking about the religious groups, it's a little bizarre for him to be saying that because, first of all, the disability rights point of view has been developed by people with disabilities using the models of understanding disability, both from a civil rights sense and from a social model of disability, that have been developed by the disability studies, among other groups, for the past 30 years. And secondly, if he is suggesting that those of us with disabilities are manipulating others with disabilities, I fail to see either what our motivations would be for doing that, because we're not getting any power or money or influence in society from doing that. You know, our organizations are very poor, and we don't have a lot of resources. People with disabilities who ask to die are given much more public attention than those of us who say that we should be allowed to live. We don't take money from the religious groups, and our message has never been influenced by the religious groups. In fact, if anything, we've influenced the message of the religious groups to some degree. So I can't quite figure out what he's trying to say, but be that as it may. So those are all the things that I ran across this week in terms of arguments in favor of assisted suicide, and those are some of my responses. If you have any questions or concerns about that, please feel free to email me at info@tv-ndy.ca, and I would be happy to talk with you about it, because, like I said, I do not want people to feel run over. There is a reason I have come to my beliefs about this, and obviously I feel very strongly and so want to convince people, but and I have heard a lot of the arguments. I think I've heard them all in favor, and do have responses for the arguments, but so I'd be happy to talk with you about it. And I don't know, I would be happy to talk about it. I don't think I would be convinced in the other direction, but I'm certainly happy to talk about it. Okay. News brief. We have a news brief, which is regarding the Ottawa shootings, which is after the shootings in Ottawa, many commentators commentators warned us not to jump to conclusions about the racial or religious motivation of the shooter. But in almost all of these articles, the commentators assumed the shooter had a mental illness. What's more, they used very derogatory terms to describe the person, such as deranged and nutcase and many others, which are fairly familiar. And my feeling is that it's great that people are being sensitive around the religious and religion and ethnicity issue. It's important not to be profiling on those issues. But we should apply the same logic and not engage in disability profiling. People with psychiatric disabilities are much more likely to be victims than perpetrators of crime. But I think what's more important to remember is that violence is a sociological problem, not a psychological problem. People may have anger as part of their psychology, but it's the way society is run and the lessons that people learn from society that tell them what actions are appropriate with their anger. And there are many images of violence in our society that to some degree give people permission to behave in violent ways. And when somebody commits a violent act, there is a lot of news coverage of it, and that certainly doesn't discourage other people. So that was something that I will be keeping an eye on, because obviously it's an issue of discrimination and devaluation of people with disabilities. So in order to, since this is supposed to be a discussion and we want to be open to what people have to say, there are a lot of ways to contact us. First of all, we have a Facebook page, which is at facebook.com/toujours vivant not dead yet. You can also follow us on Twitter, which is @TVNDY. You can find our Facebook website at tvndy.ca. You can email me at info@tv-ndy.ca. If you want to listen to older online chats, you can go to my YouTube page, and you can find that by just putting in YouTube disability euthanasia, and you'll find those chats. A lot of them are on our website. I haven't updated recently and put them up on our website, but I can do that. I need to do that. It's on my list of things to do. So you can either go to the YouTube page, or for some older ones, go to our website. And in the meantime, we will be keeping our eye out for what's going on in the community and hoping that you will join us next week and keep in touch. Thank you very much for participating, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks. Take care. Goodbye.